Siamo tmurcio.
I'm Elena Lappin. Welcome to Shop Talk with Writers. Our guest today is British playwright and author Naomi Westerman. Her fascinating book, Happy Death Club, is both a memoir and a collection of essays about grief, loss, and new ways of thinking about death. This Halloween special podcast has two parts. A few days after recording our first conversation, we continued talking while exploring a beautiful Victorian cemetery in southeast London. Naomi Westerman's book, Happy Death Club, is published by 404 Inc. We would like to thank the creative writing department at City Lit in Covent Garden for allowing us to record this interview on its premises. Shop Talk with Writers is available on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and on Elena Lappin's Substack, with a feature about the author. Thank you for listening.
I'm Naomi Westerman, and I am reading an extract from my book, Happy Death Club, Essays on Death, Grief and Bereavement Across Cultures. Conclusion. I will die on October 15th, 2057. This will be a Monday, and I won't even reach 80. This is not a psychic vision, nor a threat of a very slow suicide. It is the prediction of the death clock. The average life expectancy for women with my BMI is 96 years old. So what gives? Presumably, the fact I gouged my mindset as generally pessimistic. I go back and select neutral, and my death date shoots up to 2063, giving me an extra 5 years of life. Recheck with generally positive mindset, and I hit the jackpot. Naomi, you will live to be 97 years, 9 months, and 18 days old. It's hard to maintain an optimistic worldview when you've lost everyone. But writing this, all the people I've met and things I've learned and experienced has helped me. I hope that embracing communal grieving and talking more openly about death can help you too. I've connected more with grieving friends, found out about other people's private griefs. I've learned to count my blessings. My parents both died very suddenly, which was a huge shock, but I was spared the slow torture of watching a loved one succumb to illness, especially illnesses that destroy cognitive functions such as dementia and Alzheimer's. I've come to the conclusion that a quick death is far better than a slow one, whether it's yours or a loved one's.
Naomi Westerman, welcome to Shop Talk.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's really, really interesting to meet you. I discovered you, I can't remember how long ago. Was it 3 months ago, 2 months ago, when I read the article in The Guardian?
Yeah, that article went viral. And
It did actually go viral?
It was the most read article on The Guardian website for pretty much the whole weekend until Trump was shot. And I got bumped by Trump off the top spot, which I feel bad. Obviously, it's bad he got shot. Yeah, it did.
Are you upset about that?
Am I upset? I'm upset about the potential threat to democracy in America. I'm not particularly upset at being number 2 on the Guardian website.
And, when I read the article, to be honest, I had no idea who you were.
Sure.
I just loved the voice in that piece. I didn't know about this book, which we'll talk about in a minute. I didn't know that you were a playwright. I hadn't heard of your plays, but what I absolutely loved was how you wrote that piece, how open it was, how alive it was, how funny it was, talking about very difficult things, and how you told the story of your mother's basically triumph after her death. And your family story and history and your own, all of that just took me completely by surprise. And I loved it. And I read that article twice, 3 times, 4 times. In bits and pieces, I kept going back to it. I kept showing it to friends. So I had no idea that there was a connection between that article and this book.
Yes.
And this book, which is called Happy Death Club, Essays on Death, Grief, and Bereavement Across Cultures, is a slim volume of unbelievably powerful mini essays, you could say, because they're all quite short, but they are absolutely fascinating. And let's talk about that. And let's talk about all of it.
Thank you.
So going back to the beginning, we are actually recording this podcast in Covent Garden in Soho. There was a time when you were a homeless teenager in the streets of Soho. Where was that exactly?
Where?
Where?
I think it was just around the corner from the Prince Charles Cinema. Which I think is still the Prince Charles, right? They didn't rename it. I don't think they did. I like the commitment to that. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it wasn't for a very long time. It was just kind of the odd night here and there. But yeah.
Did you kind of burst out of the house and saying, I'm leaving and I'm going to sleep rough? Or was it part of a bigger plan?
It wasn't really a bursting out. It was more of a very, very quiet sneaking out.
Quiet sneaking out.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And how did you do it? Did you take anything with you?
I mean, the first time, no. And the last time, also no. There were other times when I did take things. It was a very, very complicated, very unsteady situation where I was just kind of trying to get through things minute by minute. I didn't necessarily always make the right choices. It's hard to remember a lot of things. It's a long time ago. But I mean, I kept myself safe. Nothing really bad ever happened. I was very lucky, I guess. Soho feels very different now.
Was your mother a young mother, would you say, when she had you?
No, not particularly. I'm trying to think. I can't remember off the top of my head how old she would have been. Maybe early mid-30s, not particularly young.
So in your article, you talk about your mother's very sudden death. And I expected the book to actually, as it's partly a memoir, I expected the book to begin with her death. But actually, it begins with your father's death, which you call a good death.
Yes.
Let's talk about that. What is a good death?
I think that's a really interesting question because I think the question that then brings up is it a good death for the person who died or is it a good death for those who are left behind? My father had a huge fear of illness. He had a huge fear of losing his personal freedom. He was someone who needed a great deal of control over his daily life, liked to have a lot of rigidity in terms of keeping to a regular schedule. He had heart surgery at one point and checked himself out of the convalescence home very early because he found it very, very stressful to not have privacy and not have freedom. I'm very grateful that he was spared any illness, that he was spared, any infirmity that sometimes comes with old age. My father basically woke up, went to work, came home from work, made a cup of tea, sat down and just dropped dead. Obviously, to lose someone so suddenly without any warning is extremely shocking if you are, one of the bereaved. And something that I have gone backwards and forwards is it better for a death to be sudden when it's a shock and you don't get to say goodbye, or is it better for it to be slow? I've not personally experienced any kind of really slow lingering deaths apart from, I guess my grandmother died of heart disease, and that was a relatively drawn-out death. I mean, not a very drawn-out death, but we certainly knew that she was dying, probably, for a few weeks, certainly, before she died. Personally, I think a sudden death, because even if you do miss the opportunity to say goodbye. I think not having to see your loved one in pain, not having to make incredibly difficult decisions about care, having to make decisions particularly, I have loved ones who have family members with dementia, with Alzheimer's, which I think is just the cruelest thing in the world. Being able to bypass all of that, I think, is better for the bereaved person.
For you?
Yeah.
But how about for them? What is a good death for the actual person dying?
I think avoiding pain. Mm-hmm. I think avoiding a long, slow death. I think being in a position where you have to come to terms with the fact that you're dying, I think must be incredibly difficult. Because, it feels like in movies, a person gets like a terminal illness diagnosis, whatever. They always, go, oh, I'm going to do my bucket list. I'm going to go skydiving. I'm going to write a book. But I don't think that's the reality of most people. And I was really lucky, I think, in that my relationship with my father was very good. And there wasn't anything kind of unresolved between us. And I don't think that he had anything kind of unresolved with anybody in his life. Even though he and my mother had long been divorced, they were on really good terms. So there wasn't kind of any kind of, history of like bad relationships or problematic relationships with family members or anything like that. And I think, there is always this idea that if someone's dying, that will be the moment that you have, the beautiful, tearful reunion and you solve all your problems and you call, your long estranged brother. My dad didn't have a brother, just hypothetically. But people are people, and I'm not really sure if people change. And I think when you're dying, you're scared. And all of your anxieties and your, trauma, whatever trauma you're living with, just comes to the surface. And you're not going to suddenly turn a new leaf and be the person, who makes amends and like finds closure with everyone and goes to death peacefully. I mean, I know that I have friends who have had parents or other loved ones die of terminal illnesses. And they were just very, very, very difficult people to live with. And the idea of like, that you shouldn't start an argument with them because they're dying is a really, really stressful thing. And they end up dying with a lot of things left unsaid. And I think that can create a trauma. So I think if you are lucky enough to be in a position in your life where you're on basically good terms with everyone in your life, maybe, a sudden death is not that bad, and I think any situation where you're spared pain and suffering, you're spared, loss of personal freedom, loss of dignity from, things like, your body failing, things like you might be dealing with like incontinency issues in hospital. Any chance that you get to be spared that, I think is probably not necessarily a great death, but a better death.
What I found really wonderful about the way you described your father's death was, you captured how it's just a routine day. He comes home from work.
Yeah.
He makes himself a cup of tea, as you said. He sits down in his favorite armchair, I suppose, with a newspaper.
Yes.
Now, all of these things actually indicate life going on.
Yeah.
Life not ending. When I make a cup of tea, I expect to drink it, or at least taste it. When I start reading the paper, I expect to either read some of it or none of it and fall asleep, or throw it away in anger. But your father went through those motions, and then it ended.
Yeah.
And of course, we don't know whether the person to whom this happens has any sort of inkling whatsoever of there being a change in their state. We don't know. But it made me think of how we literally don't know where the border is, the borderline between life and death.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm actually talking to you, because I personally have a serious issue with not understanding death.
Yeah.
I don't know. The first death I experienced in my life was a friend, and then my parents, one quite shortly after the other. And that was the first time I actually experienced it, but I didn't understand it. And I said to myself, I need to understand it. And I kind of did something similar to yourself. I started exploring it. With your mother's situation, it's a whole different situation because your mother was with an ex partner who
Yeah.
was an abusive one. She was not in a good place in her life. Your relationship was complicated. So when she left for good, you had to deal with the aftermath of that. And one way of dealing with that aftermath was a very interesting journey, which was scattering her ashes all over the world. At the time of you writing this book, you hadn't yet finished, I think not even a third of what you had.
I'm still not.
You're still not.
I mean, ashes
How
are...
do you do it? And how do you decide? How do you decide where to do it?
How do I decide? It's more predicated just on where I happen to be going. My life and my work and all the various things that I've done in my work and my personal life have led me to travel a lot. So I don't necessarily actively seek out places. Obviously, I mean, there are specific places within the UK that I have sought out that were significant. I've not traveled abroad specifically with the intention of doing a scattering. The only place that there were definitely places within London, because my mum was born and raised in London as well, that I actively sought out because they were significant to her. I was working in Edinburgh, and I took a trip to the Isle of Skye because that's where my parents fell in love, and I thought that would be a very significant place. In terms of going abroad, I mean, the one place my mum always wanted to go to was New Zealand. So I feel like that is still something that I need to do. I don't feel like I'm going to get on a plane for 24 hours to go to New Zealand just to scatter her ashes. I will wait until I get offered a job there, or I get offered some reason to go there. So mostly it is just wherever I happen to be. And then I find a place that feels right. A lot of the time that's in water. And in terms of physically how I do it, I have decreasing size of Tupperware. I have a little stackable Tupperware set. And then I just have a little, this is the most random thing in the world. I'm so sorry. It's actually, I keep pet rats, which I obviously talk about in my book. And I have a little thing that I buy that is rat vitamin and mineral supplement, which is a powder, and you put it in their water. And it's just a little thing with a little kind of cap that screws on, a little powder container. And it's about a little bit smaller than my coffee cup, maybe half the size of my coffee cup. And that is the perfect size for, a tablespoon.
And one time you did it, you say, under the watchful eye of the Carabinieri in Italy, where it's actually not legal to do. We can say it.
Will this podcast, do people in Italy listen to this podcast? So the Trevi Fountain in Rome, obviously, it is quite famous for tourists being arrested for various misbehavior. Yeah.
So you're not the only one who...
I mean, I didn't get arrested. No, but there are always tourists who get arrested, I think, for walking in the fountain, dipping their feet in the fountain, trying to kind of paddle in the fountain, or throwing things in the fountain. So I was very, very, very careful, and I literally just put a pinch, a tiny pinch, just in my hand. And then, because you can touch the water, and people like to touch the water, and I just kind of put my hand into the water, I was just going to, dip my hand into the water and then just kind of opened it. So I wasn't scattering a bag of ashes into the fountain.
And at that moment, do you think of your mum being with you or watching you or feeling something?
Yeah, because I think my mum liked the fact that I'm naturally a bit of a rule breaker. And I think that she wished that she could perhaps be more like that. And I think it would have made her laugh a lot. I mean, it's only very, very minor rule breaking, but I think she would have laughed at the idea of me being, so cautious and so careful, don't get arrested by the Italian police. I think that would have given her a really good giggle.
Do you find that after they die, we continue talking to our parents in our minds a lot. I mean, I do.
I do, but I think, I do. And I think that can be really useful. But I think it also really depends on what kind of relationship you have with their parents. Like, I mean, I, still have fights with my mum. I still have a lot of anger. I still yell at her, which is not necessarily always something that makes you feel great. But I still talk to my dad. Yeah.
As a child, you were, you've described a complicated upbringing. You've described it in the book. You've described it in the article. And you say quite openly that you were filled with rage and that rage found its way into your grief as well. And you have even, I think, you've coined it, grief rage or rage grief as a concept.
Yeah.
Is that what you still have, or is that sort of dissipating as time goes on?
It's definitely dissipating. I think being able to be honest and have a voice has really helped. And I think, the opportunities that have been given to me through being a writer and a journalist have hugely helped with that. I think feeling voiceless is, I think particularly for women, a really major source of female rage.
And that voice is your writer's voice.
Yeah.
And this is what I felt. And I mean, every sentence in everything you write is a very strong author's voice. You find the most unique ways of describing what you just observe or see or think or read about. And I just think it's an amazing book for people dealing with any kind of grief, or not even going through it perhaps yet, but thinking about it, knowing that it exists. Now, let's go back to your early life, where you at some point did, because you said you left school quite early, but eventually at some point, I don't know at what age, you did your A-levels.
Yes.
How old were you then?
Oh, how old was I? I think I would have been maybe like 24-ish, 25-ish.
And at that point, and after that, and you did it very well. You got all A's.
Thank you. Yes.
Your father was a mathematician, wasn't he?
Well, my father studied maths at Cambridge, and then he went into the IT industry. But he was someone who did maths for fun right up to the end of his life. And I actually weirdly got into contact with someone who'd been his best friend at school, literally just a couple of weeks ago, who told me that he is now a university professor at Cardiff University, and he started a program for gifted working class students because he was so inspired by my dad, who was, I think, generally pretty recognized as being a mathematical prodigy, and chose not to go down that path because he had a family and he had to, have a regular salary. But my dad was quite exceptional, and he gave me a route map, I think, to follow. And that map was very much academia, and the idea that academia can give you something to cling onto to kind of climb out of whatever not very great situation that you're in.
And so you climbed out of not being in education into getting this education, and then you applied for a place at university to study.
So originally I applied, I went to Roehampton University, which is in southwest London, and they are a slightly unusual university in that you can do a joint honours degree, or you can do, they don't call it that, but you can like major in a subject and minor in another subject, which is more like an American style of doing things. So I enrolled to do a joint honours degree in anthropology and English literature. And then I didn't really gel with studying English literature on an academic setting. So I changed my other subject from English literature to journalism.
So you've done English literature, you've done journalism or writing subjects, and anthropology.
Yes.
And within anthropology, how quickly did you begin to specialize or become interested in funeral rites and death rites across cultures?
I would say very quickly, probably in my first or second year of my undergraduate, definitely during my undergraduate degree, Roehampton at that time had a wonderful, wonderful anthropology department, which very sadly was closed, which is just a huge tragedy. It was a very small department, but that meant that I was able to develop very close relationships with my professors. One of my professors, Marzia Balzani, is now working in Dubai, but I sent her a copy of my book, which was lovely to be able to make that contact with her so many years later. So I think very, very quickly, I did become interested, I think, in anthropology's power to let you confront things that are taboo or scary or just things that we don't talk about. I remember one of my professors, Gary Marshall, one of my professors, Gary Marshall, was an anthropologist who specialized in the relationship between human beings and animals. And that got me thinking really differently about non-human death and how we perceive non-human death, how we perceive some animals as being, worthy of life and some animals as not being worthy of life, and the rituals and the various ritualistic practices around animal death. I also studied cannibalism, which was a really, really fascinating thing. I wrote a paper, or actually I think it might have been an exam, on cannibalism and particularly something called endocannibalism, which is essentially, endocannibalism means eating your loved ones, and exocannibalism is eating your enemies. So, everyone
do you eat them differently? Is there a difference?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think exocannibalism is maybe more commonplace and better known.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of like the ancient Aztecs, eating the hearts of the people they've, slain in battle. I feel like that's quite familiar to people. Or, everyone knows about Hannibal Lecter, going out and like murdering people that he didn't like specifically to eat them. And endocannibalism is a form of respect, essentially. And it's an idea of by consuming the flesh of a person who's died, you are keeping their spirit within your tribe. There are also some specific tribal people in Brazil, for example. I mean, they don't do it now. This is obviously quite a long time ago. But because they live in the rainforest, they have a taboo around the ground. And the idea that, it's very disrespectful to put your loved one in the ground because it's muddy and it's dirty, and that's just kind of like for your enemies, or if it's for, people who are very kind of low down. So the idea that you ceremonially like consume their body, you're kind of sparing them the indignity of being put into like the dirty, wet ground. And there's very specific taboos and very specific rules around who can do that. So it can't be a blood relative. And there are various reasons why those taboos are developed, but it usually goes to like the husband of the oldest daughter.
So these are difficult topics, obviously. But when you began studying burial rites and death and bereavement cultures across the globe, really, was that before you had lost your parents?
Yes. Yes.
So this was not in response to that. So why was it only because you were looking for something that was a taboo and difficult and maybe fearful topic, or were you thinking about losing them?
I don't think so. I mean, I think I'd lost my grandmother and my aunt at that point, so I had experienced bereavement. I don't think so. I think I was just very, very interested in anything that was taboo, really.
Mm-hmm. You actually lost several members of your family quite quickly.
Yes.
Within a year.
I mean, my aunt and my grandmother passed away in relatively close period of time. I had slightly more distant relatives die, and then my parents, I think, were 5 years apart.
And then you found yourself being the bearer, really, of burying them. You were in charge of all that on your own.
Yeah.
So at that moment in time, you find yourself basically alone.
Yeah.
I'll give you some of my favorite fun facts that I've collected from your book in various spots. Number one, our bones are immortal. They actually don't go anywhere. They can exist forever, long after the flesh is gone and the person was connected to originally. They just keep existing.
Yeah, that was something that I'd never thought about before. But I was living in Berlin back in I think it was 2019. So that was before. No, that was after my mum died. And I visited an ossuary, which is obviously created out of bones. And there are lots of ossuaries all around the country. There is a very famous one in Rome. There is one on the southeast coast of England. There's a very famous one in Prague, which I did not, unfortunately, get an opportunity to visit. And the idea, and they're very specifically linked, I think, to like monks and monasteries. And the idea of someone just going, hey, let's just take all these dead people and turn them into interior design. Like, it's just such a weird, it's such a weird thing.
Well, you actually took it a step further and you decided to put your dead pet rat's bones on your dad's grave.
I mean, to be fair, that was more to do with the practicalities of, I don't have a garden. Well, no, I mean, if your pet dies, like, what do you do with them? I have to say, like, I'm not personally a fan of cremation. It gives me the ick. I'm sorry. I just find it really creepy. Obviously, I did have my mother cremated, which was literally just financial because burial is just incredibly expensive. But I didn't want to have my pets cremated. Because I don't know. There's something about the integrity of the body. There's something about, you have a little body on your lap and that is such a tremendous source of comfort for you. And the vet hands you the body back and it's still warm. It feels upsetting to be like, okay, just put it in an oven now. I just found that very, very difficult.
Okay, fun fact number 2. You say that the doll that is being used for mouth-to-mouth training is actually based on a real person's looks?
Yes, it is. So the doll that is used all around the world, I believe all around the world, for CPR training, lifeguard training, whatever, is called Resusci Annie. And another fun fact in the book, the Michael Jackson song that has the Smooth Criminal has the lyrics, Annie, are you okay? It is a reference to that Annie, in case people know. There was... in Paris, something like, I don't know, like 150 years ago, something like that, maybe more than that, there was a young woman whose corpse was pulled out of the Seine. And she was just considered to be this incredibly beautiful woman who, in death, had perfect features. And there was a death mask that was made of her in the Paris morgue. And the history of the Paris morgue is really fascinating because... in the Victorian era, the Paris morgue was an incredibly popular tourist attraction. Thousands of people used to go to the morgue. There used to even be ways where you could look at like bodies of murder victims and test your own investigation skills, try to figure out who did it. There would be food vendors outside, there would be food trucks outside selling snacks. It was like an incredibly popular tourist attraction. And the death mask of this unknown young woman, which is her name, basically the unknown woman of the Seine, this death mask was held up as being the ideal of feminine beauty. And later on, when the resuscitation doll was created, the person who I believe was a toy maker, actually was a doll maker, who was, I don't know, given the commission for creating this resuscitation doll, decided to base it on this woman. So yeah, if you've ever done CPR, you were giving mouth-to-mouth to, I think she was believed to be a suicide victim, a French suicide victim from a long time ago.
You mentioned the Victorian obsession with death.
They were all about...
How did that express itself in their art, in their jewelry?
I think it expressed itself in all kinds of ways. I mean, the Victorians were kind of crazy. They were very, very sexually repressed, and that came out in a lot of other ways. And I think the obsession with death was part of that. Obviously, like, death was... the process of grieving was extremely formalized. A lot of that came from Queen Victoria herself. Obviously, when Prince Albert died, she took very, very heavy mourning. It was incredibly ritualized. these ritualistic rules really about death continued on into like the 1920s, 1930s. There's a quote from the book about Emily Post where she gives very, very detailed instructions about how long mourning should last, but it's very precise, like the amount of black you should wear. At what point do you break your mourning? At what point do you wear, like a purple ribbon instead of a black ribbon? How long do you wear a veil? It's very, very, very narrowly written out. But then also the idea of kind of almost having this fetishistic approach to the corpse. And I think the idea of putting like a dead person's lock of hair in a mourning brooch, which is a very Victorian tradition, comes from there. And it is beautiful in a way, but it's also, it's a little bit goth. The Victorians were a bit goth like that.
And so your mum had a collection of these?
Yes, which I still
have.
With
dead people's hair?
Yeah, with random unknown dead people's hair. Yeah.
I once had a phase where I collected old photographs of people I didn't know, like family albums and so on. And then one day I kind of got sick of it because I suddenly started feeling that I was surrounded by these ghosts who meant nothing to me. But I was in a green room with W.G. Sebald one day, and I told him about this because I know he was obsessed with thoughts of that kind. And he said this sentence, he said, "In death, we are all together." I'll let that just sink in. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think that's the great question that people and cultures and philosophers have been struggling with for thousands of years. What happens after we die? Do we all become part of some great collective consciousness and we all, seep into one? Or, I mean, the whole like Christian idea of death is that you remain yourself as a discrete individual and you go to heaven or you go to hell, or you go to purgatory, but you remain yourself as a distinct individual, which is terrifying. Do you want to be in heaven with like every single person that you ever like went on a bad date with? Is it crowded up there? Is everyone, trying to become like best mates with Jesus? I mean, I don't see how that could work. I don't see how you can retain any sense of individuality in the afterlife. I like the idea that there's a collective consciousness that we join in some form.
So this book is full of that kind of unbelievably wide-ranging knowledge. And the topics are fascinating to observe because as you go from essay to essay, each theme is separate, but they all connect. And then comes a moment when you say, I decided not to pursue my PhD in this field, and you became a playwright.
Yes, I did.
How did that happen?
Oh my God, it happened by accident. But one of those accidents where you think, oh, actually, it probably wasn't as accidental. I'm probably just telling myself it was an accident. So I mean, the specific reason, basically, I was pursuing my PhD and I think I was quite unhappy. I found academia very, very limiting because you have to write in an incredibly narrow way. Like you have to find like the most niche, like sub topic, and then just like hyper focus on that thing. And I wanted to write much more broadly. So I think I was very unhappy. I was very interested in theatre. I loved theatre. I'd done some acting and that made me very happy. But I never had the confidence to pursue writing. My mum also had, when I was very young, had written a novel and had tried really hard to become a writer and had not had any success. And
do you still have that novel?
I mean, I feel like I probably do have it on a computer somewhere, but I need to go and look for it. I'm sure that copies exist somewhere. I've not read it. I'm kind of waiting till I'm ready. But unfortunately, she was very, very bitter. And I very much grew up internalizing a lot of the bitterness and internalizing the idea of like writing world, theatre world, whatever is not for people like us. But I always wrote when I was a kid, and people, my teachers at school always said that I had a gift for writing. And I kind of always knew that I did. I know that's not what you're supposed to say about yourself, but I kind of did. And I kind of knew that it was something that I had potential within me. I just had a lot of weird, complex trauma around my mum and her bitterness about being a failed writer, and a lot of guilt over, that I didn't want to be more successful than her, and a lot of really complicated stuff that I should be talking to a therapist about, really. But basically, I went down the academic track because it was easier to follow my dad's example than my mum, because my dad seemed to have a really happy, successful life and career, and my mum just seemed very unhappy, and academia felt safer. And basically what happened is I had a very close friend who had a psychiatric illness, and she was sectioned, and I was like her contact person when she was in hospital. And obviously the process of being sectioned, or the process of really having any engagement with the psychiatric industry, can be really, really traumatizing, really brutal. And the way that she coped with that experience of, being deprived of her liberty was to perceive it as content, and to look at it as like a research opportunity, and to be like, oh, I'm going to write, because she was a professional actor, I'm going to write an amazing play about what it's like to be a woman in a psychiatric hospital. And I'm not here because I'm sick. I'm not here because I was sectioned. I'm here researching play. And she asked me to co-write it with her, because at the time my PhD was all about women within psychiatry and gender bias in psychiatry. And I did have a little bit of a writing background. I had written stuff in the past. So she asked me to co-write this play with her. And then when she got released, obviously, she just didn't want to be in that headspace at all. She didn't want to think about it. She didn't want to remember it. She absolutely just wanted to pretend the whole thing never happened. But by that point, I was very invested. So I kind of just went to her and said, well, I know that this is your personal experience and it was your idea, but how would you feel about me maybe writing it by myself? And I won't use your personal experience. I'll go and research it. And she was like, yes, no, you should absolutely do that. So I just finished writing this play, and I wrote like a one-act play that was like, 45 minutes long maybe. And I didn't know anything about theatre at all. I didn't know that you could send a script to a theatre. I didn't know anything. But someone just said like, oh, here's this theatre that they're saying like, send a script in, which was the New Wolseley Theatre in Ipswich. So I just kind of randomly just emailed my first draft of this like 45-minute script to this theatre, and then just kind of put it in a drawer and didn't think about it again, and didn't think, it didn't occur to me to send it to anyone else, because I just didn't know that you could do that. I didn't know that you could send a play to a theatre. And then, I don't know, maybe 2 months later, I just got a voicemail out of the blue saying, yeah, we love your play. We're going to produce it. We're going to pay you 500 quid. And I was like, oh, this playwriting lark's a piece of piss, isn't it? This is easy. And so we did it in Ipswich. It went really badly because it was programmed for 11 o'clock in the morning for a very, very, very adult play. And it was sandwiched between the play that was immediately before us, because it was done as like a festival. The play that was immediately before us was called something like, Captain Pugwash and his Friendly Parrot, and it was for like 5-year-olds. And then all the mothers with their children had to be sort of forcibly evicted from the auditorium, told, you have to go and sit in the bar for 45 minutes because the next play is rated 18. We've programmed at 11 o'clock. And then the play immediately after us was titled something like, A Salute to Ipswich, the best town ever. And then in the middle, there was just us come down from London being like, hi, here's a really edgy play about like lesbians and, self-harming lesbians in a psychiatric hospital in Woolwich, like, hi. And, I don't know how we didn't get lynched, because they were very, 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 very angry with us.
What was it called, that play?
Tortoise. But then, the other people I were working with were like, this is interesting. Maybe London people would like it a bit more. Maybe people would like it a bit more if it wasn't at 11 o'clock in the morning in front of an audience of 5-year-olds who are being physically escorted out. Physically escorted just makes it sound really bad. Sounds like they were really rowdy. So we randomly, there's a theatre called the Cockpit Theatre in Marylebone, do a thing called Theatre in the Pound. You can play a very tiny amount of money, do a showcase, and you get like 15, 20 minutes. Did that. Happened to be a huge storm. So everyone else dropped out, apart from like one other person. So they went, can you just do the whole thing? Because we don't have any other acts. So we got to do the whole thing, and I got very, very excited and just kind of sat down with Google with like a copy of Spotlight, emailed 1,000 people to just say, I wrote a play, it's going to be on, do you want to come? And then somehow we just ended up, I don't know why, because this is really unusual, but everyone in the industry came. Like people from the Royal Court came people from the National came, absolutely full house. And then they all left at the interval. No, just to be clear. So there were 2 plays on the bill. So we had like 45 minutes before the interval, and then there was another play on after the interval. So everyone left at the interval, which was really embarrassing. And then I just woke up the next morning with my phone just exploding from people going, oh, we thought your play was really interesting. Come and have a meeting. Would you like to join our playwriting group? Nobody offered me any work, but it was really interesting. And then I was just like, all right, bye academia. And then, I've pretty much worked as a playwright consistently since then.
Ever since. So how long has it been now? Since
It's like about 8-9 years.
Fantastic. So that play actually unleashed the playwright in you.
Yeah.
And everything together also obviously unleashed the writer in you, playwright, writer. And you mentioned in the book that so your father was sort of the academic gene, perhaps,
yes.
and your mom was the artistic, creative writer,
yeah.
but that you kind of ended up following in her footsteps, but with control.
Yeah, I feel
So you say that you were in control of what you were doing in your own way.
Yeah, and I think the discipline and the academic rigor that I inherited from my father has really hugely helped me as a person pursuing a creative job.
And in this book is an excerpt from a play called Batman.
Yes.
Tell me about that play. That sounds, I wish, if I could see it tonight, I would go see it.
Well, we're still trying to get something happening with it. Yeah. So Batman was a commission from a Nottingham-based theatre company called Chronic Insanity, who are a wonderful, wonderful company who have been incredibly supportive of me. And essentially, they do a lot of digital theatre, so they commissioned me to do a hybrid piece that would work as a live piece that would also have a digital aspect. And I was really interested in playing with the idea of like audience agency. So I was really interested in how do you as an artist give the audience power and how do they use that power? And then that immediately brought to mind a lot of issues around audience complicity. And one of the things, there's obviously a chapter in my book about true crime. And the true crime genre, unfortunately, can be very, very exploitative of people's trauma. And I think the question is, if you were a person who consumes true crime content, how are you mindful in your consumption of that content that you are not enabling like something that really inflicts harm on people? And something that I talk a lot about, and I'm actually going to give a talk at the Royal Court in a week or two about what I call theatre's first-person trauma industrial complex, because theatre loves autobiographical shows from people talking about their trauma. And particularly if you're a woman or if you're any kind of minority, there's a lot of pressure to write autobiographically about your trauma. Like if you are Black, the expectation is that you will write a play about your experience of racism. If you're trans, you'll write a play about your experience of transitioning and your experience of transphobia. And, you know, maybe you don't want to write that play. Maybe you want to write about Black joy or trans joy, or you want to write, I don't know, a space Western where the leads happen to be trans. But it just feels like there's a lot of pressure to be like, no, give us your trauma. And how much are audiences responsible for choosing to engage in that? So I really wanted to write a play that would give the audience agency, but also challenge them to question their own complicity. Like, you've chosen to buy a ticket to a play that is very specifically advertised as like a young woman talking about her mum maybe being killed as the result of domestic violence. Like, what in you made the decision to buy a ticket to that? And so it's very challenging of the audience in terms of asking them to make choices. But then the way we did it is that it was very interactive. So I have a monologue that is, you know, quite traumatic potentially for the audience. And then everyone in the audience is given like a little squeaky, it's actually a dog toy. that I decorated with like little bat stickers called the bat signal. And at any point they can activate the bat signal, and that forces me to stop talking and then spin. And then we had like a big sort of spinny wheel on stage, which we call the Wheel of Fortune. And I spin it, and there are various different options that basically lead to a series of what we call creative interruptions, which are basically like games that are like death-themed games, which again, they're all designed to get people talking more openly about death, but also thinking about how we engage with death content, how we engage like culturally with things like, you have Netflix making a show about Jeffrey Dahmer that is like very glamorizing of that. How do you engage in that content, and what damage potentially are you doing to the world? And how do we kind of bring the idea of death as entertainment or murder as entertainment and marry that with the reality of the pain of going through grief?
So you actually also gave, if I'm not mistaken, you gave that audience food.
Yes, we did. I mean, I didn't want to be too rough to the audience, considering they had bought ticket for my show. They, were giving me money. So we basically culminated in, I'm Jewish, and obviously in the Jewish tradition, we sit Shiva when someone dies. And I was not in a position to be able to do that when my mum died. So I ended each performance with a little onstage Shiva, which the entire audience was invited to participate in. So the audience were all given food, because sharing food is a very important part of Jewish cultural tradition, but it's also quite a big part of grief traditions throughout history and across lots of different cultures. And then basically the audience were invited to come up onto the stage and light a candle. And there's a very, very beautiful, and as I continued doing performances, this sequence became kind of longer, and I started taking my time with it, where it was just a very slow, silent parade of just people coming onto the stage and just very quietly lighting a candle and then leaving the stage. And it's just, I feel like silence is very powerful on stage, and just having a moment that was almost just like a very physical, very ritualized just parade of people lighting candles, just to kind of give the space. Because I think with theatre a lot, you feel like you have to fill all the space with talking, or, with dialogue, or with doing something on stage. And there's something about silence and kind of slowness on stage that can be so potent, because it makes you slow down mentally as an audience member and just live in that moment. And yeah, people just found that very moving.
To understand grief, to go through it, to think about it, to feel it, you do need to slow down.
Yeah.
You need the time, you need the silence. So I'm sure that was extremely powerful.
Yeah.
And you also say that this book was actually written or conceived as an idea to help people understand how to share grief in a communal way that is different from what we normally do. What are you offering or suggesting?
I think what I'm offering is an invitation for people to think about death, to think differently about death, to take a minute to sit down and just very consciously think about grief and think about death, but also an invitation to connect with other people. I think it's interesting that this book was published in Britain, because I think in Britain we don't talk about death or grief enough. They're very taboo. Obviously, there are other cultures that are much more embracive of death. Something that I didn't manage to get in the book, which I wish I had, is what I feel like is one of the most important, iconic portrayals of communal grieving or embracing death in popular culture, which is the Wake episode of Derry Girls. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the Irish tradition of the wake, where you have the body in the house and it's not a sad event and everyone in the community turns up, and the fact that that episode is so funny. It's so funny. And it's like, well, yeah, like, why shouldn't you laugh at death? It is really funny sometimes. So I think just the idea that, the way that you do things, the way that you've always done things does not have to be the way that you do things in the future. You always have the power to change your own life. You always have the power to change your own mindset. And there will be people who will support you along the way. If you come from a culture where death or grief are taboo, you do not have to stay within that culture. There are people who will support you and help you on the journey to find what works for you. People will read this book who are grieving. Maybe they will be helped by it. Maybe there will be people who are grieving who don't have that support in their life. And maybe reading this book will encourage them to find that support, because there is support out there. And that's really just the most important message that I hope people take from the book, regardless of whether you're grieving or not, or you're interested in death, or you're struggling with ideas of your immortality. There are so many different paths and so many different ways to handle death and grief and to talk about it. And if what's working for you, if what you're doing isn't working for you, find something else, because there are so many different ways.
Speaking of your own mortality,
Yes.
at the end of your book, last page, you write, "And if in 100 years eager beaver hikers should discover my bones, please, for the love of God, don't make a podcast about it."
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I am really fascinated with the true crime podcast, and particularly those that explore mysteries. And I get it. I get why people are fascinated by mysteries. But you know what?
You don't want to be bothered.
Death is weird. Death is weird. Death is mysterious. People die in all kinds of crazy, mysterious ways. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just don't make me a podcast.
What are you working on now?
What am I working on now? Well, my play Puppy, it's a queer, female-led romantic comedy about dogging and about feminist porn and about political protest. And this should be announced. It hasn't been announced yet, but it should be announced any day. So I think I can talk about it. It will be at the King's Head Theatre in Islington. And we're going to be doing, I think, a 5-week run. I think it's March, April of next year. So that's going to be my major thing for next year. Very, very exciting to get my first major run. We're in talks with some West End theatres. There's potential to transfer that. Maybe if it does well, we'll see. The play has already been performed different places around the world. It was performed in Santiago and Chile, which is really exciting. So that is my big project that I'm working on right now. What else am I working on? I'm under commission from Derby Theatre to write a play exploring disabled and neurodivergent people's experience of the UK school system. I was also recently commissioned by the Bush Theatre to write a short film basically about the rise of anti-Semitism following the October 7th attack that is part of their protest series, that I don't know when that's going to be released. I also recently was commissioned to write a short film by a theatre company called Cardboard Citizens. So that was released. That is available to watch now. And have just meetings, just lots and lots of meetings that hopefully are going to lead to more productions, but nothing has quite been signed yet, so hoping.
I mean, I'm looking at you. You're so full of bubbly energy.
It's coffee.
Excitement,
it's just coffee.
Whatever it is. And I'm thinking, going back to the beginning of our conversation, when your parents died, your mom died, your father first, your mom, and then you lost the rest, more of your family, and you felt alone at a certain point in time, having had a very, very difficult life up to that point as well. Alone. And now you are first of all, you're connected with so many people. Yeah. You're connected with so many things. You've created this life and world for yourself and others. And it's just an absolute blessing to read you. And I'm very, very grateful for this conversation.
Thank you so much.
And I've really enjoyed it so much. And I'm sure you'll be amazing to watch.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
And I'm sure there will be a Netflix series at some point based on, something.
I did get a very nice email from Netflix after my Guardian article
came
out.
You go.
But that's not, no, maybe I just don't know.
Well, let's end on that note. Let's end on that note. A reminder to Netflix, look her up. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
You've got my phone number, you've got my email address, yeah.
Naomi Westerman.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this conversation for Shop Talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Naomi, we are now at the Nunhead Cemetery, which is a Victorian one, isn't it?
Yes, it's one of the magnificent 7 cemeteries across London.
And what's so cool about it?
Oh, well...
In your view.
Well, there's one thing that's really cool that we're going to be seeing in a minute. Shall I tell you what it is?
Tell me. Prepare me.
All right, so this is not deathy, but there are a number of places in London that are called protected views, and they are places in London where you can look and you can see St Paul's Cathedral.
Wow.
And there are various protected views. There's one in Richmond Park, for example, where you can see all the way through to St Paul's, and it's the law basically that nothing can be built that impedes that view.
Okay, but that wouldn't be death related.
It's not death related.
We are here for death. So I actually have a question.
Yes, sure.
Can we just stop by these graves?
Absolutely.
What are they? Doesn't matter, but they look old.
Yeah, so
Or
I mean,
do you know?
this is a Victorian cemetery. So the magnificent 7 cemeteries were built in the Victorian era because the Industrial Revolution led to a huge increase of bodies that needed to be disposed of. Historically, a lot of bodies would have been taken out of London. You had the famous Necropolis Railway that took bodies out of London. And to deal with basically the huge number of bodies that needed to be dealt with, the Victorians built these 7 vast private cemeteries that are scattered around London. This is probably one of the least well-known ones.
Okay, well, these make me think, because these are basically, there's monuments on top of these graves, which obviously were built a long time ago, and they're incredibly solid and imposing and huge and tall. How does this make us feel as complete strangers who have no idea who David Goddard may have been, or Emma Goddard, his wife?
One of the reasons I like Nunhead Cemetery is that unlike better known magnificent 7 cemeteries like Highgate, obviously, this one doesn't have so many celebrities in it, because you go to Highgate or you go to other like very famous like Père Lachaise in Paris, people walk around with like tourist maps, and it's literally like a guide to the stars like you get in Los Angeles. You can walk around and look at the famous people's graves, and I find that a little bit uncomfortable. I don't know why. I just find it strange. Like, why do you need to know where a famous person died? Obviously, Jim Morrison's grave in Paris is very famous, even among people who, you know, are not fans of his music particularly. There's something really beautiful, I think, in the fact that you have these monuments that have lasted for such a long time that are not for celebrities. They're just ordinary people. It's really interesting to look at them and wonder what their lives were like and who loved them so much to put up these monuments, or were they just, you know, really rich people?
And then died.
The
people who looked after these graves clearly died.
Yeah.
And clearly no one is actually looking after them now, but they are still beautiful. So let's kind of try and describe this. We see these kind of, we could say monuments on top of these graves. And behind the monuments is what I would describe as a forest.
It is very overgrown, yeah. The Friends of Nunhead Cemetery do a lot of work to keep it in good condition, but as you can see, it is pretty much forest. It's a very difficult job to do.
It's beautiful, and it's very calm. Mm-hmm. Lots of dogs.
Lots of squirrels.
Lots of squirrels. Lots of dogs chasing squirrels, probably.
Yes.
Or squirrels chasing dogs. I don't know if that's a thing. And so let's kind of walk on. Mm-hmm. I really like that view. An anonymous, to me, grave to nothing. And look at this one. So we're looking past the monuments on these graves, and what we see behind them. Can we just go down here?
Yeah.
Follow me. And what we actually see are just stones.
Yes.
Just stones.
Very green.
Mossy.
Mossy stones. Yeah, covered in ivy.
And covered in ivy, covered in, branches and things, bracken. And they're hard to read, aren't they?
Yes, I want to see if I can read one.
Let's see. In memoriam, in memory of
Mr. William something Ooks. I can't quite read the first few letters of his surname. We'll just call him William. We're on first name terms as we are actually standing on top of him.
Yeah.
I can't see Yeah, everything else seems to have been very, very worn away. I can't see the dates, seem to be covered in the moss and the ivy.
So this to me is actually a kind of an example of what you describe in your book, but I don't think you mean this, but
Yeah.
to me, this is kind of synonymous with a good death,
Yeah.
post-death, because it's peaceful,
Yeah.
it's long time after,
Yeah.
and someone walks past and feels something or thinks about something. It works. And then around it, let's keep going, into into the jungle.
Into the forest. That's very
Yeah. We
dark.
go in here.
dark things happen.
Oops. Okay, so, and now
Yes.
we are in the middle of nowhere.
Yes.
We see no graves, just trees, a plane overhead, of course, and it's very peaceful.
It's very peaceful.
I think there's a stone over there.
Yes, if you squint, you can just about make the edges of two graves just sticking out of the trees, but you have to really look carefully to see them.
So you write in your book
Yeah.
that you scattered your mum's ashes in all of the magnificent 7 cemeteries in London.
Tiny little
Tiny
pinch
bits.
in each one. Yeah.
So is there one here? Is there a bit here?
Somewhere, yes.
Where?
Ooh, where? I think it's up near the main monument. There's a vast structure that I'm sure we will come to in a little bit, so it's near there.
Okay, so shall we get out of here?
Absolutely. Climb back out through the forest. It's a very interesting piece of statuary that has collapsed and been allowed to be reclaimed by nature.
Oops,
You're right.
I just almost fell. And so, so when you did that, when you scattered a tiny bit of your mum's ashes here,
Yes.
and in all the others, in Highgate as well?
Yes.
Everywhere.
Yes.
And then you go back there. Does that make you feel like she's there a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. There is something about the solidity and the permanence of these vast historic cemeteries that I find very pleasing.
There is something that I didn't ask you when we talked before, and
Yeah.
that was... Sorry, I have to go on your other side.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
What I didn't ask you, and really wanted to, was how do we write, as writers, how do we write about death, having just experienced it? And your book opens with your mention of the blank notebook.
Yeah.
Having made the decision to deal with death by writing about it. And now there's your blank notebook. How do you go about writing about death?
I think that's a really interesting question because I think writing about death is very different from writing about grief. I feel like writing about grief is very, very personal. People know what their emotions are. Writing about death can be everything from personal to very abstract. I went to see Sarah Ruhl's Eurydice, which is a play written obviously about the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, which I'm about to do a post-show talk on, talking about what we think about death, what we think about the afterlife. And it's a really fascinating play. And I think the ancient Greeks' conceptualization of death as being a physical place where you go and you retain a sense of your integrity as being like a person. You know, you're not there anymore, you're lost to your loved ones, but you're physically still yourself as like an individual person. And I think that's a really interesting way to start thinking about death. Like what happens from the perspective of the person who's died, and where are they? And where do they go? And what does that say about the integration of the body or the integrity of like the self? Do you retain a sense of individual self after you've died? It's hard to believe that the ancient Greek idea that you just kind of stroll and you find yourself in the underworld and you're still you. It's really hard to believe that our memories are intact after death, but who knows, maybe there are.
But for us,
Yeah.
who have lost
Yes.
someone, how do we think about where they are?
Well, I mean, I think it's really important that every single thing that we believe or that all the theories that exist around death, right? Doggy, all of the ideas and the religious beliefs and the iconography around death is created by the living, and it's created for the living. And it's created to give us comfort that the people we have lost, the people we have seen, maybe we physically watched them die, maybe we've watched their bodies turn into something that is not what they were. And we're very sanitized from death in the 21st century. You know, in times past, people would have been much more up close and personal with the actual physical process of watching a person die or watching a corpse, you know, start to decay, quite frankly. And we need the comfort to go, well, they're not there anymore. And if you look at a corpse, maybe, you know, probably a lot of people have never actually seen a dead body. It's terrifying to look at a dead body that looks like someone you loved and know that it's just not them anymore. And it very, very quickly stops looking like them, and it stops being familiar, and it just becomes, I'm sorry to be graphic, but rotting meat. And the idea of like, but there was a person here. There was love here, there was memories here, there was a whole entire personality that thought and felt and had wants and desires and opinions about things. And like, where is that entity now? And the idea that it just vanishes, that it just dissipates into the ether, you know, because you have the body in front of you, but where's the person? And it seems impossible that the entirety of a human being can just not exist anymore. So I think we need to believe that the soul or the personality, whatever you want to call it, continues in some way. And the idea that there's a physical place that we go to is incredibly compelling for that reason.
Which is the cemetery.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not only for those who have actually lost loved ones who are buried here, but just anyone really to come and think about that.
Yeah.
Or just to walk their dogs, frankly.
Yes. Yeah.
Many people do here. What part of London are we in, actually?
Well, we're in Nunhead, so we're in southeast London. Which is a very interesting, beautiful part of London.
It is. Do you live near here?
I live in Greenwich, so I live closer to the river. I live not so far from here.
And is this where you grew up, this part of London?
No, I grew up in North London.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay. I remember in the chapter about your father's death, called The Rat King of something.
Yes.
Is it The Rat King of...
The Rat King of South London.
Of South London?
Yes.
So you write about your kind of imaginary plan to bury your dead rats on his grave so that later on when they are found, it will be the subject of some discussion, how this man must have been very important if he has rats buried with him. And then comes this sentence that would have given him a sort of immortality.
Yeah, because I worked in museums for a very long time, it's so interesting seeing, you know, obviously I worked at the Natural History Museum where we have bones that are many, many, many millions and millions of years old, and the idea that, you know, bone is permanent, it may be permanent, you don't know what's going to happen. And the idea that, you know, a future archaeologist or a future anthropologist or who knows what might, in 100 years' time, 1,000 years' time, 1,000,000 years' time, who knows, find those bones. Who knows?
But immortality, to give him immortality, to give our parents a kind of immortality in our minds, in our hearts, isn't that what we all try to do? Because we find it so difficult to think of ourselves as having been basically abandoned by them.
Yeah.
To be an adult orphan is odd.
Yeah, exactly. And I sometimes feel that your parents are the most influential people when you are a baby. They are your whole world. And then the process of growing up is going out into the world and becoming your own person. But the bonds you have with your parents will always be the most primal ones in your life, I think, until you have children of your own. And acknowledging that your parents are immortal acknowledging that your parents are mortal, I think is, you know, a really profound moment in every child's life. You don't want to acknowledge that your parents are fallible.
So I buried my parents, my father first, my mom 2 years after.
Yeah.
And they're both buried in the Jewish cemetery in Prague, where there is a wonderful man who takes care of these things.
Yes.
And he's the closest I've ever seen to a kind of holy man. He's a real ray of light as a person. And I asked him, does he think that the Jewish way of burying the dead, grieving the dead, dealing with mourning, that very, very communal way of doing it,
Yeah.
and thinking of what happens after death, the soul, the journey of the soul, is this something that makes him feel better about it? And he said, I hope so. Which I thought was a wonderful answer. Very honest. And clearly he has his doubts.
Sure.
And he lives with death every single day. Yeah. And I also asked him, has anything changed in his profession? And he said, yes. He said, we are burying more young people.
Wow.
These days. Not because of COVID or anything, but because he thinks that young people lead much more stressful lives and have illnesses and problems that result from that stress. And they just die much younger, which is something I was very surprised by.
That's awful, yeah.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very sad. And I think the death of a young person makes you confront a lot of feelings around mortality in a way that a death of an elderly person maybe doesn't. Because, there's so much lost potential there.
What has writing this book done for you?
It's helped me to talk about death. It's helped me to connect with a lot of people. I have had hundreds of emails, Instagram messages through my agent, messages through my publisher, complete strangers from all over the world reaching out, wanting to just be seen, wanting to just tell me, a stranger. And all these messages basically said, I loved someone and I lost them. And I need you as a stranger to know that. And it's just about wanting the love that you have for someone that transcends death to be witnessed. I think if writing this book, I can be a witness to other people's grief. That's very powerful. Every single conversation I've had with everyone, they say, what's your book about? It's about death. They go, oh, my grandmother died, or oh, my dog died, or they immediately tell you their death story. And that can be a lot. Sometimes it's a lot of other people's trauma to take on your shoulders. Some of these stories are very traumatic to hear, but it feels really powerful to know that just by opening the door to a conversation, you're letting people talk about things that they may have never talked about. I feel a tremendous responsibility to my audience because I didn't fully anticipate how this quite small book was going to have such a huge global impact on people in terms of facilitating conversation. I think we don't feel that we're allowed to have.
And is it people from different cultures, different countries, different backgrounds? Massively.
I have had emails, messages from all over the world. I've had messages from America, a lot of messages from America, different countries in Europe, the Philippines, Australia, all sorts of different countries, people from cultures where death is marked or is understood in completely different ways. It's really, really interesting. Sometimes people get a little bit upset. They're like, oh, but my country has such a fascinating death ritual. Why didn't you include my country? And it's like, I can't realistically include every single death ritual from every country because it's only a relatively small book. But it is interesting. People just really want to be seen and heard.
But you are possibly planning a bigger book.
I hope so. I hope so.
You might include more.
Yeah.
But for me, the most interesting thing is really your own voice in this book.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what in literature or in theatre maybe, because you're a playwright, has particularly touched you as being an accurate maybe or a very relatable and helpful depiction of death and mourning and grief?
Ooh, C.S. Lewis wrote a book about grief, the author who obviously wrote the Narnia books, that was about his personal experience of grief. It's a very short book. Every page is like a gut punch. He writes with such incredible honesty and rawness about his emotions, and it's very, very upsetting to read. I have to say, going back to what I was saying about the ancient Greeks, I'm one of those kids who grew up really obsessed with the ancient Greek myths and legends and stuff about the Trojan War. I keep coming back to these because I feel like there's some really fundamental truths about humanity and how we view the world that I just think are so interesting. And I think all the concepts of the underworld are so compelling to read about. The idea that you can, if you're dedicated enough, if you love enough, you can walk into the underworld and you can take someone back. All the myths of Orpheus, the myths of Persephone, they're so fascinating in terms of revealing that across the centuries, human beings and our relationship to death has really not changed.
And what about Hamlet?
Yeah, I think what I love about Hamlet is that obviously, for one thing, going back to rats, it does open, it opens with a little rodent. So that's quite interesting. One of the only rodents in Shakespeare. But it also opens with a ghost. And I think that's another example of how human beings don't change, because there is not really anything about the supernatural in this book. Mm-hmm. If I wrote a bigger book, it would be really interesting to include that. But yeah, our belief in ghosts, our belief in the paranormal, the supernatural, all of that comes from an unwillingness to believe that death is the end of existence.
That it's final.
Yeah.
In any way. Well, I just read on Lad Bible.
Yeah.
That a guy somewhere in England was fined for dressing up as a ghost and scaring people.
Right.
So he was fined on that. I don't know what law there is against doing that.
It's called the Scooby-Doo law.
Oh, really?
No, I'm joking. But that is a very, very Scooby-Doo. Was he trying to scare off property developers?
No, he was just having fun.
Fine.
He was having fun, which I think is great. I wouldn't fine him for that.
No. I'm surprised that that's illegal.
So,
why is that illegal?
Naomi, here is a very interesting monument.
Yes.
In loving memory of George Thomas
Congreve,
who was
of Coombe Lodge, Peckham, and of Stretton Hove, Brighton.
Oh.
So he lived in both Peckham and Brighton, I guess, who entered into rest, that's such a beautiful Victorian euphemism, on March 14th, 1898, in his 77th year. And there's a quote saying, yonder they rest from their labours, and their works do follow them. That's very Victorian, industrial revolution, work hard. And,
but then we have Matilda.
Yes.
Below Thomas, we have Matilda. In loving memory of Matilda, the beloved widow of George Thomas Congreve. So she had a bit of fun after he was gone.
Yes.
And it says, who fell asleep February 16th, 1918. See, she had quite a long time.
Exactly. In her 90th year.
Oh.
Until the day break and the shadows flee away.
Which I think is a quote. There's a quote there from the Bible.
Yes.
Isn't that a beautiful inscription?
It is a very beautiful inscription.
It kind of has everything we were talking about.
Well,
accepting the flying away, the fleeing away, the going away, but that what remains kind of follows us or remains important. And, in that context, I was thinking of how you told me that your mum has written a novel.
Yes.
But you haven't yet read it.
Yes.
And I think it's super important that you read it. I'd love to read it. Because what if you discover something in that novel that will help you understand something about her? Or is that something you're afraid of doing?
Well, my mum was a very complicated person. She had a lot of problems. I could equally discover something upsetting. I don't know. It is a thing. Going back to Hamlet, what you're saying about graves, My mother obviously doesn't have a gravestone as she was cremated, but I put up a bench, a memorial bench to her. And the bench is actually engraved with a quote from Hamlet.
Is it?
Yeah.
Which one?
Passing through nature to eternity. Oh. It's a quote spoken by Gertrude.
That is beautiful, because I think this cemetery is exactly that.
Yeah.
You feel when you walk through these paths and among the trees and the stones and the monuments and the names, you feel like you are passing through nature to perhaps something that we can call eternity.
Yeah.
Although not yet for us, I hope.
I mean, you never know.
We're going to get back to the tube. So I feel like we've really covered everything.
Cool.
There's one brilliant idea in your book which we haven't yet touched on, and that was your very insightful comment that forget the 6 stages of grief, you say. There are only 2.
Okay, yeah.
Active and passive, or passive and active, and accepting, and what was the opposite of accepting?
Denial, probably. I would need to reread the book.
Yeah, and then that really marks the difference between putting temporary items on graves and the permanent ones. So flowers versus stones.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is a theory of mine. In a lot of different cultures across the world and across history, there is this idea that when someone dies, they go through, or their spirit goes through a liminal process. So they don't just like die and like romp, you wake up a baby and you've been reincarnated, or romp, you're in heaven. There is some kind of process, there is some kind of liminal ground, there is some kind of testing process. You think about, I mean, like the ancient Egyptians ritualized this process very much with the weighing of the heart against a feather. You have the idea of St. Peter at the golden gates of heaven, looking in the book of life. There are lots and lots of different cultures and different religions that have the idea that your soul is in some way tested, or that you might have to spend a period of time in purgatory, for example, before you go on to wherever it is your soul ends up. And sorry, I'm just out of breath. One of the most interesting things that I learned when I was an anthropologist was this idea of the double burial that takes place. I studied it specifically in relation to parts of rural China, rural like northeastern China, but double burial does exist in other parts of the world. And it's this belief that basically you bury a body outside of the town, outside of the community, and then after a set period, you basically dig it back up and you reinter the bones, and you have a second burial of the bones that might be in like the family crypt, it might be, wherever it is, it might be in your household. And it's basically the idea that while there is flesh on the body, the dead person's ghost or spirit is in that liminal space between life and the afterlife, where basically the dead person doesn't know that they're dead, and their spirit or their ghost is hanging around and is really confused and vengeful because they haven't come to terms with the fact that they're dead, and it's very dangerous to have them around. They kill the crops, they cause pregnant women to miscarry. And the idea is, once the flesh has dissolved and the bone is left, that marks the end of the liminal period, where the flesh is gone, you've just got nice, safe, solid bones, and the ghost or the spirit has now completed its journey to the afterlife, and you are safe to bring the bones back into your household, back into your family crypt, and the ghost will look down on you from the afterlife, whatever, and will bring good fortune to you. And I feel like, this idea that the dead person goes through a period of liminality matches the idea that you go through a period of liminality that is grieving, that is like very active grief, where you have denial, where you have shock. And when you come to the point of acceptance, you will still be living with the pain of grief because that never goes away. But you go through the liminal stage and you get through it. Ultimately, you get through it. And I just have a lot of theories around the idea that, you put flowers on the grave because they are temporary, and then at some point, you put the headstone up and that is permanent, and there is something about the liminality of flowers that I think represents that. And obviously, talking about being Jewish, we don't do that. We don't put flowers on graves. We put rocks on graves. So what does that say about the Jewish history, the Jewish identity, that we do not, or historically have not had the freedom to have a permanent memorial where you can come back to it and you can put flowers on it?
Well, my mother collected rocks while she was alive, obviously, many of them. And she said, please make sure that you put all of these on my grave.
Sure.
But they were so heavy, ultimately, that I couldn't really bring all of them. Now, Naomi, we have just arrived at my absolutely favorite grave in this cemetery that I've seen so far.
Cool.
To someone named Thompson. We don't know whether he or she was a man or a woman. It is just a huge rectangle, isn't it? Like a big box.
Yeah, I would
and
say that's
on
6
top of
feet
it is
wide.
absolutely nothing.
I would say roughly, maybe.
Yeah.
Taller.
Nothing on it, no monument, nothing else, no inscription, just the name. And there's a stone on it.
Yes.
And leaves and a bit of muddiness and surrounded by kind of bits of foresty,
lots of
style
ivy,
nature.
holly.
Yeah.
Oh, Christmas
holly
is coming, winter is coming. Can you see the
definitely.
berries on the eye?
Crows around, other birds sounding a bit more friendly. But this, to me, is kind of perfect because it can be anything. It invites. It's kind of inviting because you may want to sit on it and think. A dog may pee on it.
I think my friend's dogs probably did just pee on this. Actually.
Probably. But it doesn't pretend to be anything more than just a place for a person, or maybe more than one.
Yeah, it could be a family grave. It's big. And it's not set into the ground, it's raised. So, I mean, I don't know what's under there. The bodies, are they buried in the ground, or are they, if we came along with a sledgehammer, would the skeletons be right there in the open? I don't know. It's a very intriguing grave.
It is, isn't it? I really, really like it. Well, would you be here at night? Or would you find it spooky and scary?
I wouldn't find it spooky. I would not be here at night because I just think as a woman, there are human predators.
Exactly. And then we're back to the dangers of life, not death.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, well, let's make our way back. And thank you very much.
Thank you very
Naomi
much.
Westerman, for talking to us about the cheerful subject of death in a very cheerful way. I should say thank you, Naomi Westerman, for talking to us about the not very cheerful subject of death, but in a very cheerful way.
Thank you very much for having me.
Siamo tворча. Now that we started then, the place started to take shape.